The Harrington House had been many things in its long life. A private estate, a warehouse during the lean years, and now, for the past decade, the kind of venue that charged 4 figures per table and made guests feel like they had earned something by walking through the door. On a Thursday evening in late October, its main hall had been rented out for the 30th anniversary gala of Prestige Land Group, a regional real estate development company whose executives had a habit of renting things that cost more than they were worth. Brass chandeliers threw warm light across the parquet floors. Waitstaff in black moved between white draped tables, carrying trays of things most guests didn't finish. A string quartet in the far corner played something no one was quite listening to. In the foyer bar, a man named Parker Stout was on his 3rd scotch and building momentum. Parker was 41, the company's director of sales, and the kind of man who confused being heard with being respected. He had spent the better part of that afternoon arranging what he called a social experiment, which was his way of saying he had arranged something cruel and wanted someone else to thank him for the creativity. He had told Roy Kellerman, pipefitter, 22-year subcontractor for Prestige's construction division, that there would be a lovely woman at the gala who had specifically asked to be introduced to someone steady, someone real. He had used the word real the way people use it when they mean less than. The woman Parker had chosen for this introduction was Ingrid Solano. She was already seated at the center table of the hall, alone, with a glass of water and her hands folded in her lap. She was 34 years old, with dark hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, and a dove-gray dress that had been chosen for its quality and not its display. She was, by any measure, a woman of considerable presence, but Parker had not seen presence. He had seen what the room had decided about her the moment she arrived. Quiet, unattended, out of place, and he had decided she was the perfect match for a man who was also, in his estimation, all of those things. Roy Kellerman arrived at 6:47 with his daughter pressed close against his left side, and a grip on her hand that was careful rather than tight. He was 44 years old, built wide through the shoulders the way men get when their work is physical and long, and they have never bothered to apologize for it. He wore the same navy blazer he had worn to every event that required a blazer in the past 8 years, paired with dark slacks he'd pressed on the kitchen table that morning, while Phoebe sat on the counter eating cereal and asking him questions about cloud formations. His shoes were polished. His collar was open at the top, because the top button had gone missing sometime in September, and he hadn't gotten around to fixing it. Phoebe Kellerman was 7 years old and held a small smooth stone in her right hand, the way other children hold a stuffed animal. It was a river stone, gray-green, worn perfectly oval by water or time or both. Her mother had given it to her 3 years ago, 2 weeks before she died, and told her it was a luck stone, and that luck was just kindness that had somewhere to land. Roy had grown up outside of Cincinnati, the youngest son of a man who fixed boilers and a woman who worked dispatch for a trucking company. He had not gone to college, because the money wasn't there, and the need wasn't obvious, and he had never once resented either of those facts. He had learned pipe fitting from his uncle, taken to it naturally, and spent the next 2 decades becoming the kind of worker whose name got passed around in handshakes and job site recommendations. He had married Sandra Kellerman at 29, and they had 3 good years before the diagnosis and 4 harder ones after. Sandra had died on a Tuesday morning in March, and Roy had sat in the hospital parking lot for 40 minutes afterward. Not because he didn't know what to do next, but because he was deciding, right then, what kind of man he was going to be for the child asleep in the back seat. He had decided he would not be absent. He would not be bitter. He would not let Phoebe grow up believing that the worst thing that happened to you was the only thing that defined you. In the years since, he had learned to French braid hair from a video Phoebe found herself and made him watch 3 times. He had learned which grade of grilled cheese she considered acceptable and which she considered an insult. He still carried Sandra's old thermos to every job site. She had painted sunflowers on it with nail polish the winter before her diagnosis, lopsided and deliberate and not at all artistic, and Roy had never once thought about buying a different one. At work, the foreman trusted him because his estimates were honest, and his repairs held, and he had never once thrown a fit on a job site. But Parker Stout and the men who gathered in Parker's orbit had decided that Roy's steadiness was a kind of poverty. They called him, never to his face and always with a laugh, Thermos, because of the sunflower thermos, because it gave them something small to feel superior about. 3 weeks before the gala, Phoebe had come with Roy to the Prestige construction office to drop off paperwork during a school break. She had waited in the hallway while Roy signed forms, and she had heard two men in the break room talk about her father, in a voice they believed carried only to each other. One of them said that Roy might actually show up to the company party, if thought someone would feel sorry enough for him. The other laughed and said that a man hauling his kid everywhere like a security blanket probably just needed a woman to feel good about herself for 15 minutes. That night, while Roy made soup and Phoebe sat at the kitchen table doing homework, she had asked him, without looking up from her worksheet, whether he ever got tired of it just being the two of them. Roy had set down the spoon and sat across from her. He had waited until she looked up. He had told her, quietly and without any performance, that the day she was born was the day he understood what he had been building his whole life toward, and that everything since had been on purpose. Phoebe had thought about that for a moment, and then gone back to her worksheet, and Roy had gone back to the soup, and neither of them said anything else about it. But he had thought about that conversation every day since. He thought about it on the drive to the Harrington House. He thought about it when he took Phoebe's hand in the marble foyer and felt her squeeze back. Ingrid Solano had spent the first 8 years of her adult life learning that a name could be taken from you faster than anything else you owned. Her father, Marcus Solano, had built a small catering and event services company out of genuine labor, and by the time Ingrid was 22, it had a solid local reputation and a serviceable revenue. When she was 26, his business partner, a man who had been Marcus's friend for longer than Ingrid had been alive, restructured the company's debt in a way that left her father holding the liability and nothing else. Marcus had fought for 18 months, lost, and died of a stroke 6 weeks after the final court decision. Her mother had moved in with a sister in Phoenix. Ingrid had stayed. She had taken a job on the event staff of a catering company her father's old business had once supplied with linens. She worked tables, set glassware, loaded vans at 5 a.m, and unloaded them at midnight. She did not tell anyone what her last name had once meant in certain rooms. She saved money in a way that looked like deprivation from the outside and felt like patience from the inside. The Harrington House was the first venue she had ever worked, at 23. Carrying trays of appetizers through a side entrance, while guests in gowns walked through the front. She had built her consulting firm quietly, and had spent the past 4 years acquiring properties in the region that she believed had been undervalued by people who confused age with ruin. The Harrington House had been on her list for 3 years. She had completed its purchase 7 weeks before the Prestige Anniversary Gala. She had asked Gerald Hennessy, the venue's longtime manager, who had stayed on through the transition, not to announce her name. She wanted to see how the property ran when no one knew she was watching. So she had taken a seat at the center table and asked for a glass of water. And she had watched the way a woman watches a place she has been quietly learning for a very long time. Parker Stout had seen a woman alone at a center table and decided she was the punchline waiting for its setup. When Roy and Phoebe appeared in the hall entrance, Parker rose from the bar and crossed to a cluster of colleagues near the edge of the parquet. He raised his voice to a level designed to carry. He announced, with the warmth of a man who believed charm and cruelty occupied the same space, that Roy had finally arrived, and that everyone should know the company had done their hard-working friend a kindness tonight. He said there was a woman at the center table. Here he gestured broadly toward Ingrid, perfectly suited to a man like Roy. He said the two of them together were exactly the kind of couple you could put in a catalog under the heading, "Better Than Nothing." A few people laughed before they fully processed what had been said. Most did not. Roy walked the length of the hall in silence. He did not look at Parker. He did not look at the men who had laughed. He walked with Phoebe's hand in his, and he stopped at a respectful distance from the center table and nodded at the woman seated there and said good evening the way he would have said it to anyone. Ingrid returned the nod without lifting her eyes from her water glass. Parker, reading the room as still having space for more, stepped forward. He said, louder now, that he wanted to make a toast. He said that Roy had spent the better part of 2 decades making sure the pipes didn't burst, and the least the company could do was find him a dinner companion who understood what it meant to be overlooked. He invited the room to drink to 2 people nobody had quite known what to do with, and he said it as though generosity had motivated him. The laughter that came was thinner than he had wanted. An older woman 2 tables over set her fork down. A man in a gray suit stopped chewing and did not start again for a few seconds. A waiter near the service station glanced briefly at the ceiling, as though the sound had asked something of him. Phoebe understood the shape of the words, even when the specific meanings slipped past her. She had learned, the way children learn things they should not have to learn, that certain kinds of laughter were designed to pin someone in place. She tightened her hand around the river stone in her pocket and pressed her shoulder against her father's arm and did not cry, because she had seen what happened to her father's face when men like this made her cry. One of Parker's colleagues, emboldened by proximity to someone who appeared to be getting away with something, added that maybe Roy's daughter could give the ladies some pointers on fitting in. The remark reached the hall the way cold water reaches bone. The waiter near the service station set down the tray he had been carrying. Roy, who had been reading the room with the patience of a man who knew how to assess a job site before the first wrench turned, felt something in his chest move from stillness into decision. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn toward Parker. He drew back the empty chair beside Ingrid with both hands. The way you draw back a chair when the only thing on your mind is making sure someone has a place to sit. He helped Phoebe into the seat to Ingrid's right and waited until she was settled before he took the chair across from Ingrid and looked at her directly for the first time. He told her, in a voice that did not require the whole room but reached it anyway, through the quiet that had gathered, that he was sorry. He told her he had no part in arranging whatever this evening was supposed to be, and that whatever she had been made to feel in the last few minutes, she had not earned it. Ingrid looked up from her water glass. What she saw on his face was something she had spent a long time not expecting. A man who was not asking for credit, who had not yet noticed that what he had just done was something worth noticing. Parker, losing the room by degrees, crossed the parquet with his glass. He stopped at the edge of the center table and looked at the 3 of them, with an expression arranged into something resembling ease. He said Roy shouldn't be so sensitive, that the whole thing had been a bit of fun among colleagues who had known each other for years, that nobody meant anything by it. Roy turned his head slowly and looked at the man he had worked beside for the better part of a decade. He told Parker evenly that if this was his version of doing a friend a favor, he now understood why Parker didn't have many friends who came back for a second one. Several guests at surrounding tables drew breath at the same moment. Roy was not done. He told the room, without raising his voice and without looking away from Parker, that he had come tonight because a coworker had told him there was someone worth meeting. He said he had not come to sit in a hall where grown men used strangers as material because they didn't have anything more interesting to offer, and he said, with one brief look at Phoebe, that he would not stay anywhere that asked his daughter to learn that mocking a person was the same as having a sense of humor. The hall went quiet. Not performance quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when a room remembers it has a conscience. The string quartet in the corner let the last note of a phrase dissolve and did not begin the next one. Ingrid watched Roy's profile in that stillness. She had been in a great many rooms in her life, rooms where men with more money than patience had decided in advance what she was worth. And she had become very skilled at reading the angles of a person's words. She could not find any angles in Roy Kellerman's. He was not performing. He did not know, she was nearly certain, that he was doing anything worth watching. Roy turned back to Ingrid, and his voice changed, dropping into the register of something meant for one person. He told her that if she wanted to leave, he would walk her out himself. If she wanted to stay, he would sit across from her for as long as she chose, and either way, the rest of the evening was hers to decide. Ingrid Solano had not been offered a real choice since before her father died. The bankruptcy had been chosen for her, the grief had been chosen for her. The years of people deciding, before she walked into a room, what she was permitted to be, all of it had been chosen for her by men who assumed they had that authority. And here was a man in a blazer with a missing top button, asking her, in front of everyone who had just tried to make her into a prop, what she actually wanted. She told him she would like to stay. He nodded once, as though the matter were entirely straightforward. Phoebe, who had been watching all of this with the concentrated attention of a child, who has learned that adults saying important things sometimes forget to explain them, reached into the pocket of her dress. She drew out the riverstone. She held it in her open palm for a moment. Gray-green, smooth, worn oval, the size of a quail's egg. Then she leaned across the table and set it very carefully in front of Ingrid. The way you set something down when you want the other person to understand it matters. She told Ingrid that her mom gave it to her before she went away. She said her mom called it a luck stone, and that sharing luck was the only way to make it bigger. She said Ingrid looked like she might need some luck more than Phoebe did tonight. The stone sat on the white linen, like something the table hadn't expected. Ingrid looked at the stone, then at Phoebe, then at the father whose hand rested on the back of his daughter's chair, perfectly still. She asked Phoebe, very softly, if she was certain, if giving it away meant she wouldn't have it herself. Phoebe thought about it with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to problems they have decided to take seriously. Then she said that she still had the things her mom told her, and those things were inside her, where no one could reach them, so the stone was okay to share. She said it the way a child states a fact she has already settled privately, and is only now reporting. The sentence was not designed to be remarkable. It was just what Phoebe knew. Ingrid pressed 2 fingers to her lips for a moment. Then she reached forward, and picked up the stone, and held it in her closed hand, and her eyes filled, and she let them, because she had run out of reasons to hold them steady. Across the hall, Parker Stout watched the center table and felt the entire architecture of his evening coming apart. The laughter at his table had been gone for several minutes. 2 of his colleagues had developed a sudden interest in their bread plates. The woman near the window had turned her chair so that her shoulder faced away from him. He had been the center of rooms his entire adult life. He could not tolerate the specific sensation of no longer being it. He crossed the parquet a second time. He planted himself at the edge of the center table and addressed Roy with the directness of a man who believed bluntness and confidence were the same thing. He asked Roy, in front of everyone who was still pretending not to listen, to be honest just this once. He asked whether, if Roy had his pick of anyone in the room tonight, he would genuinely choose to be sitting at this table. It was the kind of question that was not a question at all. It was an invitation to humiliate himself in public, as a way of confirming the story Parker had decided to tell. Roy looked at Ingrid first. Not long, just a check. The way you check on someone you have decided is your concern. Then, he stood. He rose to his full height without pushing back his chair or making a production of it. And he answered Parker in a voice that was steady, because steadiness was the thing he had practiced for 4 years in a house where a small girl was always listening. He said yes. He said he would sit at any table where someone was being made into a joke. because he had never once in his life been able to sit still and watch it happen, and feel all right about himself afterward. He said it was not about this particular woman or this particular room. It was about the fact that two people had walked through that door, and a third person had decided, before knowing a single true thing about either of them, that they were worth less than the space they occupied. Parker tried for a thin smile and said that Roy was making himself sound like some kind of hero. Roy shook his head once. He said he was not trying to be anyone's hero. He said he was only trying to be a man his daughter could describe accurately someday, without having to leave any part out to make it sound better. Parker opened his mouth to answer. Phoebe did not wait for what came next. She climbed down from her chair and stood between the two men with her hands at her sides, and she looked up at Parker with an expression that had nothing afraid in it. She called him sir, because her father used sir for men he had decided not to respect, but had also decided not to be rude to, and she had been paying close attention to that distinction for a long time. She told Parker that her dad always said the loudest people in any room were usually the ones most afraid of the quiet ones. She said she thought he must be very afraid of her dad. She said it the way a child reports a rule she has memorized, because it has proven itself reliable. Then she turned to Ingrid. She told her she could see she was trying not to cry, and that it was okay, that some nights just needed crying, and that was nobody's fault. She reached up and held out her hand, palm up, the way children do when they have decided on a friendship before the other person has caught up. The hall did not go quiet so much as stop entirely. The waitstaff along the walls stopped moving. The woman near the window who had turned her chair lifted her hand to her mouth and did not lower it. The string quartet had not resumed. A man near the back of the room cleared his throat once and then seemed to regret even that small interruption. Ingrid took the small hand that was offered to her. She did not use her voice because she could not trust it. Roy came around the table and gathered Phoebe against him and told her, in a low voice that was only for her, that she didn't need to say anything more. He pressed his cheek to the top of her head and held it there. Ingrid watched them from her chair, and the tears she had been holding finally went, quietly and without apology, and the room around her, almost without meaning to, went with. Not everyone cried. But the people who didn't were the ones looking at the people who did. And the looking was its own kind of acknowledgement. The main hall's service door opened then with the quiet authority of a hinge that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Gerald Hennessy, the Harrington House's venue manager for the past 19 years, silver-haired 62, with the bearing of a man who had spent 2 decades making difficult situations look effortless, walked through it with 2 staff members at his back. His face, when he saw Ingrid at the center table, with her napkin pressed to her cheek, moved through concern and then sharpened into apology. He crossed the floor and stood beside her chair, and inclined his head with a formality that did not belong to ordinary venue management. He told her, addressing her as Ms. Solano, that he was sorry for the delay, that he had not realized she had taken her seat in the main hall rather than the management suite, and that the properties board was assembled in the east wing whenever she was ready. He asked whether she needed anything before he escorted her. A soft murmur crossed the hall. The sound of people repeating one name to themselves and finding that it no longer meant what it had meant 60 seconds ago. Parker Stout's face moved through 3 different expressions in 5 seconds and settled on something that had no color left in it. Gerald Hennessy saw Parker then for the first time, and he registered the man's position, standing over Ingrid's chair, glass in hand, 3 steps closer than courtesy permitted, with the careful neutrality of someone who had spent 4 decades in hospitality learning that the most effective responses were the ones delivered at temperatures no one could argue with. He addressed the hall in a voice pitched to reach every table. He said that Ingrid Solano was the chief executive of Solano Venue Group, which had finalized the acquisition of the Harrington House 7 weeks prior. He said that as its owner, Miss Solano was, naturally, the host of every event held on the property, including this one. He said it with the smallest possible pause after the last word, and let the room do the arithmetic. The hall contracted. Glasses were set down. Eyes went to tablecloths. A woman near the floral centerpiece discovered something requiring her immediate attention in her own lap. The two men who had laughed earliest at Parker's toast found that they had very little to say to each other. Parker took a half step backward, as though physical distance might revise the last hour. Ingrid rose from her chair. She smoothed the front of her dress with the calm of a woman who had survived rooms far worse than this one, and had stopped needing the survivors to apologize. She stood still for a moment, and every person in the hall, who had not yet been looking at her, was looking at her now. She turned to Parker and looked at him fully. She told him that she understood he had not known who she was when the evening began. She said that was precisely why what he had done mattered, that he had given himself permission to be cruel to her, because he had decided before she said a single word that she was no one worth considering. The cruelty hadn't required a reason, she said, only an audience willing to sit still for it. She said it without performance, without a raised voice, and the words reached the back of the hall before Parker had assembled a response. He tried with what remained of his composure to call it a misunderstanding. He used the word light-hearted twice. He said no one had intended any real harm. Ingrid waited for him to finish. When he had, she told him quietly that a joke required two things to actually be a joke: someone to tell it, and someone who found it funny. She said that for as long as she could remember, the people doing the telling had been very comfortable deciding for everyone else which role they were supposed to play. She turned to Gerald and asked for a full list of the venue's contracted vendors, the names of any companies currently under retainer for the property's maintenance services, and a briefing on the conduct standards she could expect to be enforced at any event operating under the Solano name. Gerald produced a notebook from his jacket pocket and began to write without being asked twice. Parker's two remaining colleagues at the bar quietly collected their jackets from the backs of their chairs. Ingrid addressed the hall one final time. She looked across the white-draped tables at the guests who had gone very still, and she told them she had worked in this building for the first time at the age of 23, carrying trays through the side entrance while people in gowns walked through the front. She said the difference between that night and this one was not the dress or the title. The difference, she said, was only that some of them were speaking to her differently, now that they knew who she was. She said she didn't believe that was something any of them wanted to be proud of. She said she was willing to bet they didn't believe it either. The contract with Prestige Land Group's events division was reviewed and restructured the following week, and Parker Stout's name did not appear in the new terms. He left the Harrington House that night through the same side exit the catering staff had always used, without ceremony, and without an audience, escorted by two members of Hennessy's door team. What he lost in the end was the only thing he had spent his entire adult life constructing: a room full of people willing to laugh on cue. When the hall had thinned and the string quartet had packed their instruments away into soft-lined cases, Ingrid came back to the center table, where Roy still stood with Phoebe, who had fallen asleep sitting upright in her chair, in the weightless way of young children, her cheek against her father's arm. Ingrid looked at the child for a long moment. Then she knelt, in her dove-gray dress, in her good shoes, on the Harrington House's parquet floor, and she waited until the girl stirred. Phoebe blinked. Ingrid told her she wanted her to know something. She said the luck stone was the most valuable thing anyone had handed her in a long time, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant that Phoebe had offered it. Phoebe, half asleep, thought about this for a moment, and then asked if Ingrid felt better. Ingrid told her she did, and that it was because of her. Phoebe said good and closed her eyes again. Roy carried her to the car in the cool October air, and Ingrid walked beside them to the parking lot. and the stone was in her closed hand the entire way. And neither of them said a great deal. But the silence between them was the kind that comes after something real has already been said and doesn't need repeating. 6 months later, on a Tuesday in April, Roy was at a job site just east of downtown, tightening a water main fitting in the mechanical room of a community center that Ingrid's company had purchased from the city the previous November. She had asked him, in her office on a February afternoon, to serve as the project's lead site coordinator. He had told her, holding his cap in both hands, that he wasn't sure he was the right person for something like that. She had leaned forward across her desk and told him she didn't need someone qualified to run a conference room. She needed someone who could tell which wall was load-bearing before the first contractor made a claim about it, and someone whose word she trusted without needing it in writing. She said he should take a few days. He called her the next morning. Phoebe was sitting on the front steps of the community center that Tuesday afternoon, drawing on a paper bag with a marker, when Ingrid's car pulled up a little after noon. Ingrid had coffee in a thermos and sandwiches in a brown paper sack, and her hair was loose, and she was smiling in the easy way of someone who has been sleeping better than they expected to. She sat down beside Phoebe on the steps and asked to see the drawing. Phoebe held it up. It was a rough sketch of the building, with windows added where there weren't any yet, and a large tree out front that she had decided ought to be there. Ingrid studied it for a long moment. Then she asked if she could keep it. Phoebe said yes, but only if Ingrid let her draw a better one once the building was finished. Ingrid said that was more than fair. Roy came out of the side entrance a few minutes later, brushing dust from his forearms, and found them sitting together on the steps. Ingrid looked up. Phoebe had already moved on to asking a question about whether certain trees grew faster than others, and whether anyone got to choose which kind went in the ground. Roy sat down on the step below them and listened to Ingrid answer, and the afternoon light had the particular quality it gets in late April in the Midwest, where the warmth is still new, and everything looks briefly more possible than usual. Back in Ingrid's office, on the fourth floor of a building across town, the river stone sat in the shallow ceramic dish where she kept her keys. She had not placed it there because she was superstitious. She had placed it there because every morning, when she picked up her keys, it reminded her of something she intended never to forget. That the best people she would ever meet would not be the ones who treated her well, because they knew who she was. They would be the ones who treated her well, before they had any reason to. Roy Kellerman had not known, on the evening of the Harrington House gala, that the woman across the table from him had built something extraordinary out of years of quiet, unglamorous work. He had not known she owned the building they were standing in. He had not known anything about her at all, except that she was a person, that she was being made to feel like less than one, and that the girl beside him was watching to see what kind of man her father was. He had given his daughter the only answer that ever really mattered. He had stayed.